If you would have told me at the beginning of the year that Pragmata would be in the conversation for one of the best games to come out this year, let alone rival some of the biggest releases, I would have told you you're crazy. Yet here we are, because Pragmata does something that most other games can't. It's comfortable being a focused experience, while so many modern AAA games are trying to be everything at once. Rather than chasing the open world, intricate story, and 60-hour runtime, Pragmata trades all that in to have an incredibly smart, polished, and most importantly fun combat system, proving that games don't need to be massive to leave an impression. That being said, those decisions do come with some trade-offs. The story and character development definitely feels secondary to the gameplay. The final stretch of the game suffers from some artificial difficulty, and going for the platinum can become a little tedious. But honestly, these criticisms are really nitpicky in the grand scheme of things, because despite all of that, I walked away from Pragmata far more impressed than I ever expected to be. And that's because Pragmata trusts that the gameplay will carry the experience for the players, and I really think it does. And before we jump in, quick spoiler warning, as I will be talking about all contents in the game. The only word that comes to mind when I have to describe Pragmata's combat system is unique. It's unlike anything I've ever played before, in the best way possible. It's just such a distinct experience to essentially be playing two characters at the same time, and to have their game mechanics mesh together so cohesively. A lot of the time the combat is slow and methodical, and then all hell breaks loose and you'll find yourself fighting in these tight spaces with multiple robots at once. The interesting thing is that in these combat scenarios, my first instinct was to always panic and jump around without any real strategy. However, Pragmata forces you in these chaotic moments to slow down and again focus on one enemy with hacking so you don't get too overwhelmed. It creates this intense dynamic where even when things get chaotic, it forces you to slow down and strategize. Rather than just mindlessly firing your gun at enemies, it forces you to stay engaged the entire time. This push and pull creates a really fun combat and hacking loop that never gets tiring. It's really interesting too because 90% of succeeding in Pragmata is managing enemy positioning and hacking efficiently. The gunplay is probably the least important part because you have to succeed at both of the prior things in order to even use Hugh's weapons properly. The weapon variety in the game is really good, and I think the main reason it works is because every weapon feels like it has a purpose. Rather than just throwing a bunch of guns at you and hoping something sticks, Pragmata encourages you to think about how each weapon works with the others. Overwhelmed by drones? Throw down a barrier and use the homing missiles. Too many of those annoying samurai-looking bots? Lay down a stasis net and go to town with the jackhammer. Need to get rid of one of those giant baby-looking bots quickly? Use a sticky bomb to speed up hacking and then finish it off with a shotgun. What I love is that the game constantly rewards experimentation. I found myself gravitating towards certain combinations of guns, but there are plenty of ways that you can approach combat. The strategies feel endless, and that's what keeps encounters fresh the entire time throughout the game. That being said, there are a few weapons that I didn't really like. The first one being the hacking mines. Outside of a few challenges, I just found them to be really gimmicky and not worth the setup. I like that you're able to infuse hacks into them, which essentially applies an AoE debuff, but I just didn't enjoy having to set them up in most situations. The charge piercer is another weapon that I thought was lacking towards the end of the game. In the opening levels, it's much more useful because you don't have anything at your disposal really, but once you get more weapons and upgrades, I think other attack units are just better. The last weapon that I didn't really like is the carbine. I felt like I was constantly having to reload it, and then the recoil was really hard to control. So most of the time, I just opted to use the pistol because I could be way more intentional with my damage output. I do think it's important to note, however, that even though I didn't prefer these weapons, I still think they're fun to use. Weapons are only one piece of the puzzle though. There are also mods, nodes, and upgrades that help round out your builds. Essentially, there are three paths that you can lean into: hacking, shooting, or heat builds, and you can even mix and match some elements of each. Maybe there's not that much room for customization as some players would like, but I honestly appreciated that. Pragmata never overwhelms you with options. It gives you enough flexibility to make your build feel like you own it without burying you in systems just for the sake of complexity. Like all combat-focused games, enemy variety can really make or break the experience. Pragmata manages to keep you on your toes throughout the levels by introducing new enemy types very consistently. I found them all to be really enjoyable, and it keeps encounters fresh all the way until the end of the game. Fighting bots individually is only a small part of the experience, however, and what I found more interesting was when these enemies were thrown together in a mob for you to deal with. Your strategy is constantly in flux depending on the type of bots that you're fighting and how big the encounter is. If you're in a fight with a lot of Mark II enemies, they're way more aggressive, so you'll have to move around a lot more. However, what you prioritize can change depending on what's accompanying them. If they're paired with an executor, I'd probably focus on the Mark II bots first. But if there are watchers or an impeder mixed in, those are getting deleted immediately. because trying to deal with the drones and aggressive melee units at the same time is just a nightmare. I found the boss fights in Pragmata to be really fun and engaging as well. The strategy for each fight is different from the next. They encourage you to experiment with different weapons and approaches, which I thought was pretty fun. There's also a good sense of scale in these encounters. It genuinely feels like you're fighting these massive machines, and the damage that you inflict feels proportional in a way that makes the battles feel satisfying. Ironically though, while the bosses are great, they never really became the highlight for me because the moment-to-moment combat was already so engaging. Another part that I want to touch on is the post-game and lunatic difficulty. If you're a completionist like I am, you'll have to complete both of these modes for the platinum, and those experiences really helped shape my opinion of Pragmata. First, there's the unknown signal mode, which lets you unlock the true ending to the game. I really like this concept, but the challenges themselves didn't do too much for me. They're fine, I just found them to be more tedious than exciting. In order to unlock all the challenges, you have to 100% every area and then also fight the boss again. I had already done my 100% playthrough like the first time, so having to go back in unknown signal mode and basically just kind of ram through a bunch of challenges, I didn't find it particularly fun. However, your mileage will probably vary. Lunatic difficulty, on the other hand, is where I think the real game is. It really forces you to be intentional with your build and then how you strategize in each level. You can die from the smallest mistakes, and because of that, every encounter demands your full attention. It's hard, but fair. I went with a heat build for my second playthrough, and it took me a while to kind of settle into that, and the beginning of the game can particularly be a little rough because you have to start over from scratch. So I found myself having to think through every encounter and every resource that I used. I genuinely think that this is the best way to experience Pragmata, and I wish Capcom didn't lock the difficulty behind a normal playthrough. Obviously, I'm a little biased here because I'm not a huge fan of second playthroughs for games, but I think having the option from the start would have been nice. And I think that's really where the magic of Pragmata lies. Whether you're playing on normal or throwing yourself into lunatic difficulty, the game never loses sight of what makes it special. It understands that the combat loop is the star of the show, and instead of distracting you with other mechanics, it doubles down on that one strength. In a lot of ways, that confidence is what makes Pragmata feel so refreshing. Capcom knew exactly what they wanted this game to be, and rather than trying to chase every trend under the sun, they focused on making one thing about it exceptional. Pragmata doesn't bury you in a bunch of complicated systems like skill trees, open world activities, or convoluted mechanics. Instead, it hands you one of the most unique combat systems that I've played in years and tells you, go have fun. Pragmata trusts that the gameplay will carry the experience over the finish line. And honestly, they are right to have that confidence. Sure, the story and the world might not have the depth of some other games, but everything that is here is polished to an absurd degree. At the end of the day, gameplay is king, and Capcom signals a ton of confidence in this game by putting all of its faith into that combat loop. And to be fair, they absolutely knocked it out of the park. There's an important distinction that I want to make about Pragmata's story. I think the story itself is actually good, but the way that it presents that story is not. What I mean by that is a lot of heavy lifting is done through text logs rather than the actual cutscenes. The major story beats are obviously presented to you throughout the campaign, but a lot of the details surrounding Luna Filament, the Delphi Corporation, Edis, Dr. Higgins, and the larger world are buried in documents that are scattered throughout the game. And this is probably just me personally, but I've never really been that type of player that enjoys stopping every 15 minutes to read pages of lore and then try to piece everything together myself. I usually wait for a story explainer and then watch that instead because they're probably going to understand it way better than I could. Because of that, I found myself checking out of some of the world building during my first playthrough. I understood what was happening, but I didn't always understand why it was happening. After finishing the game and then watching a video to help fill in some of those gaps, I actually came away appreciating the story a lot more than I initially did. At its core, Pragmata tells a surprisingly emotional story underneath all of the sci-fi. On the surface, it feels really familiar. You have an evil corporation hiding dangerous secrets, questionable experiments, advanced technologies, and all the usual sci-fi tropes. But once you dig into the story surrounding Dr. Higgins and his daughter, it becomes a lot more tragic than I expected. Learning that Higgins dedicated so much of his life to trying to cure his daughter's illness that he essentially missed the time that he had left with her was really heartbreaking. Then you discover that the Pragmata program was modeled after her, and that Eight's entire plan was set into motion because she misunderstood Dr. Higgins' final wish. It's one of those twists that isn't necessarily shocking, but it did recontextualize everything that came before it. The more I learned about what was actually happening, the more I appreciated the story that Pragmata was trying to tell. That's also why that I wish more of this information had been presented through cutscenes, hologram recordings, or environmental storytelling instead of text logs. There's genuinely a lot of interesting lore and emotional context here, but I think the game hides some of its best storytelling behind optional reading. Maybe that criticism says more about me than it does the game, but I do think that Pragmata would have benefited from being a little more willing to show rather than tell. Even with these issues, Hugh and Diana are the reason that this story works so well for me. Diana starts the game as this insecure Pragmata who isn't confident in her abilities. Over the course of the story, through Hugh's encouragement and everything they experience together, she slowly becomes more independent and confident in herself. Hugh's growth is a little more straightforward. He starts as what is essentially just generic orphaned astronaut guy, but over the course of the game, he slowly takes on a parental role toward Diana. I do think Hugh's development can feel a little more rushed at times. It does feel pretty obvious early on where his character arc is heading, but even knowing where the story does go, it doesn't really lessen the impact. What makes their relationship work is how naturally it ties into the gameplay itself. The entire game is built around Hugh and Diana relying on one another. Hugh can't defeat enemies without Diana hacking them first, and Diana can't survive without Hugh protecting her. That dependency isn't just a gameplay mechanic, it's the foundation of their relationship. As they learn to trust each other in combat, they also learn to trust each other as characters. It's one of those situations where the gameplay and the story are reinforcing the same idea, and I think Pragmata deserves a lot of credit for that. There are multiple moments throughout the game where everything just slows down and the game simply lets you spend time with Diana. Along your journey, there are little optional interactions where you can stop and show her different things throughout the world. One of my favorite moments is in the Luna Mines, when Diana spots Earth off in the distance. The two of them just stop for a minute and talk about it. There's no combat, there isn't any major plot revelations, there's no real emotional speech. Diana just says that she wants to go to Earth with Hugh. But ultimately, it's just a nice quiet moment between these two characters. Those little moments ended up being some of my favorites in the entire game. They gave both characters room to breathe, they strengthen their relationship, and they make you more invested in where the story ultimately ends. By the time the finale rolls around, I wasn't really invested in Delphi Corporation, or Luna Filament, or Dr. Higgins anymore. I was invested in Hugh and Diana. And honestly, I think that's Pragmata's biggest accomplishment as a story. The plot itself never reaches the same level as the gameplay. It's not as polished, it's not as refined, and it does hide some of its most important details behind optional lore. But despite those shortcomings, it still managed to make me care more about these characters in a relatively short runtime, and that isn't easy to do. By the end of the game, I genuinely wanted Hugh and Diana to succeed, and I wanted to see more of this universe. So while I think that the storytelling could have been stronger, I still walked away really impressed by what they accomplished here. If this is actually the start of a new franchise like we all hope, then they've built a foundation that I absolutely want to see expanded on. To close out my thoughts, Pragmata is a phenomenal video game, and probably my favorite game of the year so far. The combat system is actually innovative, and makes for a really fun gameplay loop. The story is a little text heavy for my liking, but by the end of my time with Pragmata, I came to really like Hugh and Diana as characters, which is the most important part. Even with its minor flaws, Pragmata feels like a game that knows exactly what it wants to be. It doesn't try to reinvent the open world, pack itself with 100 hours of content, or overwhelm you with systems for the sake of having them. Instead, it goes all in on a unique combat system, and trusts that the gameplay is enough to carry the experience. And honestly, they are right. In an industry where it feels like every major release is trying to be bigger than the last, Pragmata succeeds by being focused. Every mechanic, upgrade, enemy encounter, and boss fight exists to support the core gameplay loop, and that confidence pays off in a big way. Sure, the presentation could be stronger, post-game challenges get a little repetitive, and some of the late-game difficulty feels a little excessive. But these issues never overshadow what makes Pragmata special. The moment-to-moment gameplay is simply too good. Pragmata is an easy recommendation for me, and I'm putting it at the top of S tier. This game is firmly in my Game of the Year conversation, and I know we have some pretty big game releases coming later this year, but I think that this will definitely be up there in the conversation for me by the end. Capcom trusted that the gameplay could carry this experience, and after rolling credits, I think that trust was more than earned.